I'm 73 years old, and I haven't been the same person since that October night in 1984, when I learned that sometimes the monsters we run from are more human than the people we trust. For 39 years, I've carried a secret that would sound insane to anyone who didn't live through it, about a single mother named Linda, who disappeared into the Cascade Mountains and what followed her out of those dark woods 3 days later. My name is David Patterson, and at the time this story begins, I was a 34-year-old search and rescue coordinator for Jefferson County, Oregon. I'd spent 8 years leading teams into wilderness areas to find lost hikers, crashed aircraft, and people who'd simply walked into the forest and never walked out again. I thought I'd seen every kind of tragedy these mountains could produce: hypothermia, falls, animal attacks, equipment failures that turned routine camping trips into death sentences. What I hadn't seen was someone being hunted through 70 square miles of old-growth forest by something that moved with intelligence and purpose, far beyond any known predator. What I hadn't seen was a creature that could track human movement with supernatural precision, yet chose to protect rather than destroy when it finally caught up to its quarry. Linda Morrison was 26 years old, recently divorced, struggling to support her 4-year-old daughter Emma on a waitress salary that barely covered rent and groceries. She'd taken Emma camping that weekend in October as a birthday treat, choosing a remote site near Crater Lake because she couldn't afford the developed campgrounds that charged fees she couldn't pay. It was supposed to be 2 days of hiking, marshmallows over a campfire, and the kind of mother-daughter bonding that creates lifelong memories. Instead, it became a nightmare that started when something began circling their campsite on Friday night. Linda called it in as a possible bear encounter, requesting advice on whether to pack up immediately or wait for daylight. The ranger station suggested she secure all food and remain in her vehicle overnight, standard protocol for large predator situations. What happened next defied every piece of training we'd developed for wildlife encounters. According to Linda's testimony, given 3 days later in a state of exhaustion and terror that made coherent questioning nearly impossible, the creature that approached their campsite wasn't a bear. It was something that walked upright, stood nearly 9 feet tall, and demonstrated behavior patterns that suggested deliberate stalking rather than random wildlife interaction. It circled their position for hours, never coming close enough for a clear visual identification, but making enough noise to keep them awake and increasingly terrified. When Linda tried to drive out Saturday morning, she found that something, had systematically disabled her vehicle during the night. Spark plug wires cut with precision, tires deflated but not damaged beyond repair, battery cables disconnected in ways that suggested mechanical knowledge rather than random vandalism. Whatever was hunting them understood internal combustion engines well enough to disable them without permanent damage, trapping her and Emma in country so remote that cell phones were useless and hiking out with a 4-year-old was effectively impossible. That's when the real chase began. Linda grabbed emergency supplies, put Emma on her back in a hiking carrier, and started walking toward what she hoped was the main road, 15 miles away through terrain that challenged experienced hikers. What followed was 3 days of cat-and-mouse pursuit through some of the most dangerous wilderness in the Pacific Northwest, with something following them that stayed just outside visual range, but made its presence known through broken branches, disturbed campsites, and the kind of systematic tracking that suggested military training rather than animal instinct. The search team I led found Linda's abandoned campsite on Monday morning, after Emma's father reported them overdue and local rangers discovered the disabled vehicle. What we found there challenged every assumption we held about wilderness emergency situations. The campsite showed evidence of deliberate sabotage by someone with extensive knowledge of automotive systems and outdoor survival. Footprints around the perimeter were human-like but impossibly large, pressed deep into soil that suggested body weight far beyond normal human parameters. More disturbing were the signs we found along Linda's escape route. Someone had been following her systematic attempt to reach civilization, but instead of attacking or hindering her progress, they'd been helping in ways so subtle she probably never noticed. Water sources had been cleared of debris, potentially dangerous trail sections had been marked with small stone cairns, and emergency shelter materials had been positioned at strategic locations along her route. We found Linda and Emma 48 hours later, exhausted and dehydrated but alive, at a ranger station 12 miles from their original campsite. Linda's account of those 3 days would have sounded like hallucinations brought on by exposure and fear, except for physical evidence that supported every impossible detail of her story. Someone, something, had been following them through the forest, but not as a predator stalking prey. Linda described glimpses of a massive figure moving parallel to their route, always maintaining distance but clearly monitoring their progress. She described finding caches of fresh water and edible plants at moments when Emma was near collapse from exhaustion. Most remarkably, she described the moment when her pursuer finally revealed himself completely, stepping into a moonlit clearing where they'd stopped to rest, showing himself to be exactly what no rational person could accept: a creature that belonged in folklore, rather than modern wilderness encounters. What caught up to Linda Morrison in those woods wasn't the monster she'd been running from. It was someone who'd been protecting her and Emma from dangers they never knew existed. Someone who understood that a single mother and her child were innocent casualties in a world where his very existence made him the most hunted being in North America. The search began at 0600 hours on Monday, October 15, 1984, when Emma Morrison's father contacted Jefferson County Sheriff's Department to report his ex-wife and daughter overdue from a camping trip that should have ended Sunday afternoon. The weather had been clear and mild for October, with daytime temperatures in the 60s and no precipitation forecasted, ruling out the environmental emergencies that accounted for most wilderness rescues in the Cascade Mountains. I assembled a 12-person team at the Crater Lake Ranger Station, including experienced trackers, medical personnel, and 2 K-9 units trained for wilderness search operations. The plan was straightforward: locate Linda's campsite, assess the situation, and follow standard protocols for missing persons in wilderness settings. I expected to find evidence of injury, equipment failure, or simple navigation errors that had delayed their return to civilization. What we found instead challenged every assumption we held about wilderness emergency situations. Linda's campsite, located roughly 4 miles from the nearest access road, showed signs of what could only be described as deliberate sabotage. Her Honda Civic had been disabled with mechanical precision: spark plug wires cleanly cut, air filter removed, battery cables disconnected but not damaged. The work demonstrated knowledge of automotive systems far beyond casual familiarity. More disturbing were the signs around the perimeter of the camp. Footprints in soft earth near their tent showed human-like impressions, but with dimensions that defied normal parameters. Nearly 18 inches long, 8 inches wide, pressed deep enough into soil to indicate body weight approaching 400 pounds. The stride length between prints suggested a bipedal gait, with legs significantly longer than any known human could possess. My tracking specialist, Ray Kowalski, had 23 years' experience reading wilderness crime scenes, but he stood over those prints for nearly 10 minutes before offering any assessment. "David, I've never seen anything like this," he finally said, crouching beside the clearest impressions. "The depth and pressure patterns suggest bipedal locomotion, but the size parameters don't match any known primate species. And look at this." He pointed to details that became clear only under magnification. The prints showed what appeared to be dermal ridges, fingerprint-like patterns on the sole surfaces that indicated sophisticated nervous system development. More remarkably, they showed evidence of deliberate weight distribution designed to minimize ground disturbance, suggesting someone with extensive knowledge of tracking countermeasures. The trail left by Linda's escape attempt was equally puzzling. We could follow her route easily: a mother carrying a 40-pound child through dense forest leaves, obvious signs of passage. But parallel to her path, maintaining consistent distance of 30 to 40 yards, ran another trail that showed the same oversized footprints we'd found at the campsite. Someone had been following her, but the spacing and positioning suggested surveillance rather than pursuit. More puzzling were modifications we found along Linda's route. Fallen logs that would have blocked her path had been moved aside. Creek crossings had been improved with strategically placed stones that created better footing for someone carrying heavy loads. In several locations, we found small caches of materials that seemed designed to assist rather than hinder her escape attempt: containers of fresh water positioned near natural rest stops, edible plants gathered and left in locations where she would have needed sustenance. "This doesn't make sense," said Janet Miller, our team psychologist who specialized in victim behavior analysis. "If someone was stalking this woman and her child, why help them survive? The pattern suggests protection rather than predation, but from what? And by whom?" We followed the dual trail system for 6 hours, documenting evidence that became increasingly difficult to reconcile with conventional understanding of wilderness encounters. Both trails showed signs of intelligence and planning far beyond random movement. Linda had chosen routes that minimized exposure and maximized opportunities for rescue discovery. Her mysterious follower had chosen positions that provided optimal surveillance while remaining hidden from view. At approximately 1400 hours, we reached a clearing where the trail evidence told a story that challenged everyone's assumptions about what had been happening during Linda's 3-day ordeal. The clearing showed signs of extended occupation, compressed vegetation where 2 people had rested, scattered food wrappers, and a small fire ring constructed with obvious knowledge of wilderness survival techniques. But the most significant discovery was a series of drawings scratched into the soft earth near the fire ring. The images were crude but unmistakably representational, a large figure and 2 smaller ones, positioned in ways that suggested interaction rather than confrontation. Below these figures, someone had scratched what appeared to be directional arrows pointing toward the main access road, along with symbols that seemed to represent water sources and safe camping locations. Somebody was giving them route guidance, Ray observed, photographing the drawings from multiple angles. "This whole thing has been about getting them to safety, not keeping them trapped out here." The K9 units picked up human scent leading away from the clearing, but they also detected something else, a complex biological signature that didn't match any species in their training repertoire. The dogs showed obvious confusion, alternating between normal tracking behavior and the kind of alert responses they'd been trained to exhibit around dangerous wildlife. As we prepared to follow the scent trail toward what we hoped would be Linda and Emma's current location, Ray pulled me aside for a private conversation that would haunt my dreams for decades afterward. "David, I need you to prepare for the possibility that we're dealing with something outside normal parameters," he said, checking his equipment with the nervous energy of someone facing an unprecedented situation. "The evidence suggests intelligence, planning, and knowledge of human behavior. But the physical characteristics don't match any known human population. We might be walking into something that changes everything we think we know about what lives in these mountains." I nodded, not fully understanding what he was preparing me for, but trusting his experience enough to approach the remainder of our search with heightened alertness and an openness to possibilities that our training had never addressed. We found Linda and Emma at the Rim Village Ranger Station at 1730 hours, 42 hours after beginning our search and 3 days after their ordeal in the mountains had begun. They were physically exhausted, dehydrated, and showing signs of prolonged stress exposure, but alive and remarkably free of serious injuries considering what they'd endured. Emma was sleeping in her mother's arms while Linda sat wrapped in emergency blankets, staring at nothing with the 1,000-yard gaze I'd seen in combat veterans and trauma survivors. Initial medical assessment showed they'd been surviving on minimal food and water for 3 days, yet their condition was better than expected for people lost in wilderness conditions. Emma showed no signs of hypothermia, despite overnight temperatures that had dropped into the 40s. Linda had minor cuts and bruises consistent with traveling through dense forest, but none of the serious injuries we typically saw in extended wilderness emergencies. The real story emerged slowly, through careful questioning conducted by our team psychologist while medical personnel monitored Linda's condition for signs of delusional thinking or hallucination brought on by stress and exposure. What Linda told us challenged every assumption we held about wilderness survival and predator behavior, painting a picture of 3 days that defied rational explanation. According to Linda's account, the creature that had disabled her vehicle and followed them through the forest had never attempted to harm them. Instead, from the moment they began their desperate hike toward civilization, it had been protecting them from dangers they never realized existed. On their first night sleeping in improvised shelter, Linda had awakened to find fresh water containers placed near their campsite, positioned where Emma would find them when thirst became critical. He never came close enough for me to see him clearly during daylight, Linda explained, her voice barely above a whisper. But I knew he was there, moving through the trees about 50 yards away, matching our pace exactly. At first I thought he was hunting us, waiting for us to collapse from exhaustion. It took me until the second day to understand he was actually guiding us. The guidance had been subtle but unmistakable to someone desperate for any advantage in their fight for survival. When Linda chose routes that led toward dangerous terrain or away from water sources, she'd find obstacles that forced route changes, fallen trees positioned to block paths, disturbed earth that suggested unstable ground ahead. When she chose directions that led toward safety and resources, the way forward would be inexplicably clear, as if someone had been removing barriers and marking safe passage. Most remarkably, Linda described interventions that had prevented serious injuries or death. When Emma had wandered away from their rest stop on the second day, attracted by what she thought were pretty berries that were actually toxic, Linda had found her daughter sitting safely several yards away from the poisonous plants, which had been uprooted and scattered in obvious warning. Someone had recognized the danger and acted to prevent poisoning. On the second night, I heard something large moving around our campsite. Linda continued, accepting water offered by medical personnel but maintaining intense eye contact, as if she needed to convince us of her sanity. Not trying to get close to us, but circling the perimeter like a guard dog. In the morning, I found tracks from what looked like a mountain lion that came within 30 feet of where Emma was sleeping, then turned away abruptly. Something had chased it off. The most extraordinary encounter had occurred on the third morning, when Linda and Emma had reached a creek that was too deep and fast-moving to cross safely. Linda was attempting to find an alternate route when she realized they were being observed directly for the first time. The creature that emerged from the forest was exactly what no rational person could accept: a massive bipedal figure covered in dark fur, standing nearly 9 feet tall, watching them with obvious intelligence and concern. I was terrified, Linda admitted, her hands shaking as she recalled the moment. Emma was so exhausted she could barely walk, and here was this thing that looked like something from nightmares just standing there looking at us. But he wasn't threatening. He was evaluating the situation. What happened next challenged everything Linda thought she knew about intelligence and communication. The creature had gestured toward a fallen log that spanned the creek about 20 yards upstream, indicating a safe crossing point that Linda hadn't noticed. When she hesitated, uncertain whether to trust something that shouldn't exist, it had demonstrated by walking across the log itself, testing its stability, and showing her the safest foot placement. "He helped us," Linda said, her voice filled with wonder that hadn't diminished despite 3 days of reflection. This thing that I'd been running from in terror was actually helping us survive. He guided Emma across the log first, staying close enough to catch her if she slipped, then helped me cross with the backpack. And then he just disappeared back into the forest. The final leg of their journey had taken them through terrain that would have been impassable for someone carrying a small child, but their mysterious protector had continued providing assistance. Steep sections had been equipped with rope made from twisted plant fibers. Rocky areas had been marked with stone cairns, indicating safe routes. Water sources had been clearly marked with arrangements of sticks and leaves that created unmistakable directional indicators. By the time we reached this ranger station, I understood that we'd been protected for 3 days by someone who knew these mountains better than any human could, Linda concluded. Emma thinks we met a nice monster who helped us get home. I don't know what to think, except that we're alive because something that had no reason to care about us chose to care anyway. The physical evidence supported every detail of Linda's account, no matter how impossible it sounded. Our follow-up investigation of their route found the rope installations, the cairn markers, the cleared obstacles that had facilitated their survival. Most convincingly, we found clear photographic evidence of the massive footprints that had paralleled their entire escape route, maintaining perfect surveillance distance while providing protection from dangers they'd never known existed. The aftermath of Linda Morrison's rescue created problems that extended far beyond standard search and rescue protocols. Within hours of her debriefing, word had spread through law enforcement and Park Service channels that something unprecedented had occurred in the Cascade Mountains. By Wednesday morning, my quiet ranger station was swarming with federal agents, military personnel, and individuals with credentials I'd never seen before, all demanding access to evidence and witness testimony related to what they described as a potential national security incident. Agent Harrison from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service arrived first, accompanied by what he claimed was a specialized team for investigating reports of unknown species. Their equipment and behavior suggested military training rather than traditional wildlife research, encrypted communication devices, weapons that looked more suitable for capture than euthanasia, and a level of preparedness that indicated they'd been planning for exactly this type of situation. "Mr. Patterson, we need to discuss classification levels and information security protocols," Agent Harrison explained during our first briefing, spreading documents across my desk that required security clearances I didn't possess. Mrs. Morrison's account describes contact with what may be an undocumented species of significant biological and strategic importance. All evidence related to this incident is now classified under national security provisions. The classification order effectively silenced everyone involved in the rescue operation. Team members were required to sign non-disclosure agreements that carried criminal penalties for unauthorized discussion of what we'd witnessed. Linda Morrison was relocated to a safe house for extended debriefing, with Emma placed in temporary custody, while federal agents determined whether continued civilian involvement posed security risks. I was assigned as Federal Liaison Coordinator, responsible for maintaining operational security while providing continued access to the search area for what Agent Harrison described as follow-up research activities. In practice, this meant I spent the next 6 months watching specialized teams systematically hunt for the being that had protected Linda and Emma through 3 days of wilderness survival. The hunting operation was sophisticated beyond anything I'd encountered in civilian law enforcement. Teams equipped with thermal imaging, motion detection equipment, and tranquilizer weapons designed for large mammals established monitoring stations throughout the Crater Lake region. Helicopters conducted systematic aerial surveys using technology that could detect heat signatures through forest canopy. Ground teams with tracking dogs specifically trained for unusual scent patterns followed every trail that might indicate non-human bipedal movement. They never found him. Despite months of intensive searching by people with virtually unlimited resources and technology, the being that had saved Linda and Emma seemed to have vanished completely from the mountains where he'd presumably lived for years. Motion sensors detected normal wildlife, but nothing matching the physical parameters we'd documented. Thermal imaging revealed deer, elk, and bear populations, but no signatures suggesting humanoid creatures of unusual size. Most frustratingly for the federal teams, they found clear evidence that their quarry was aware of the search and was actively evading capture, using countermeasures that suggested intelligence far beyond what they'd expected. Monitoring stations would be found dismantled without triggering perimeter alarms. Equipment caches would be discovered and examined, with components carefully removed in ways that suggested someone was studying surveillance technology to understand its capabilities and limitations. "We're dealing with someone who understands modern tracking methods better than most of our own personnel," Agent Harrison admitted during one of our weekly briefings. "The evasion patterns suggest military training or extensive experience avoiding human detection. This isn't random wildlife behavior. This is strategic thinking by someone who knows exactly what we're trying to accomplish." The psychological toll on everyone involved in the operation was significant. Months of searching for something that might not exist, combined with strict classification requirements that prevented normal discussion of our activities, created an atmosphere of paranoia and frustration that affected team morale and operational effectiveness. Several specialized personnel requested transfers to other assignments, citing stress-related health concerns that couldn't be addressed through normal medical channels because of classification restrictions. My relationship with Linda Morrison became a casualty of the federal involvement. She was relocated to another state as part of witness protection protocols, with all contact between us prohibited under national security provisions. The last time I saw her was during a final debriefing session, where she looked at me with eyes that had lost the wonder and gratitude I'd seen immediately after her rescue. "They don't believe me anymore," she said quietly, while federal agents waited outside the interview room. "They think I hallucinated the whole thing. That exposure and fear created false memories of something that never existed. They're treating me like a patient instead of a witness, and they're treating Emma like evidence to be managed rather than a child who needs stability. The worst part was watching Emma's account of their experience change under persistent questioning by specialists who seemed determined to reframe her memories in ways that eliminated supernatural elements. The 4-year-old who had initially described a nice monster who helped them get home gradually began referring to a big man who had provided assistance, then finally to someone who was probably just another hiker who had offered help during their emergency. 6 months after the rescue operation began, the federal teams quietly disbanded and left the area, officially concluding that Linda Morrison had experienced hallucinations brought on by stress and exposure. The physical evidence we documented was reclassified as inconclusive, attributed to known wildlife activity and environmental factors that had been misinterpreted under emergency conditions. I was reassigned to a desk job in Portland, effectively ending my career in wilderness search and rescue. The official explanation was budget reduction and organizational restructuring, but I understood that my knowledge of what had really happened in those mountains made me a security risk that needed to be managed through geographic separation and career limitations. The being who had protected Linda and Emma disappeared completely from official records, reduced to classified files that would probably never see public scrutiny. But I knew the truth, and that knowledge would haunt my remaining years in ways that changed my understanding of what intelligence means and what kinds of consciousness might exist in the wild places we think we've mapped and conquered. The truth came back to haunt me 27 years later, in the form of a phone call that shattered the careful silence I'd maintained since 1984. On November 12, 2011, Linda Morrison contacted me at my retirement home in Bend, Oregon, her voice carrying the weight of nearly 3 decades spent living with memories that no one else would validate or believe. "David, I need to see you," she said without preamble, as if our conversation was continuing from where it had left off in that federal safe house 27 years earlier. "Emma's getting married next month, and before she starts her own family, I need her to understand what really happened in those mountains. I need someone who was there to help me tell the truth." Linda was 53 now, grayed and weathered by decades of carrying secrets that had isolated her from normal human relationships. Emma had grown into a successful attorney who believed her childhood memories of forest rescue were distorted recollections of a traumatic experience that had been resolved by conventional search and rescue operations. The federal debriefings had been so successful that Emma no longer remembered the being who had saved their lives. We met at a coffee shop in Salem, neutral territory where Linda could speak freely for the first time since her federal handlers had relocated her to witness protection. The woman who sat across from me bore little resemblance to the terrified mother I'd pulled out of the wilderness in 1984. This Linda had been hardened by years of forced silence, transformed by the knowledge that her government had valued her story only long enough to determine it posed no useful intelligence value. "They destroyed Emma's memories," Linda said, her voice carrying anger that had been building for nearly 3 decades. Systematically, carefully, using techniques that made her doubt what she'd experienced until she convinced herself it had been hallucination brought on by stress and exposure. My daughter thinks the most significant event of her childhood was a camping trip that went wrong, not an encounter with someone who saved our lives. But Linda's reason for contacting me went beyond maternal frustration with government manipulation. She had news that changed everything I thought I knew about the being who had protected them in 1984. Information that had taken her decades to piece together through careful research and connections with other people who'd experienced similar encounters. "He's real, David. Not just the creature we met, but his whole people. There's a community of them living in the deepest wilderness areas throughout the Pacific Northwest, and they've been protecting lost humans for generations. What happened to Emma and me wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern of intervention that goes back decades. Through networks of cryptid researchers, indigenous communities, and other witnesses who'd been discredited or silenced by federal investigations, Linda had documented dozens of cases similar to theirs. Lost hikers found alive after impossibly long survival periods in conditions that should have killed them. Missing persons discovered in locations that suggested someone had guided them to safety rather than random luck leading to rescue. Most remarkably, she'd found other mothers with children who described identical experiences: mysterious protection during wilderness emergencies, guidance that led to safety, and subsequent federal debriefings that resulted in classification and forced relocation. The pattern suggested not just a single being helping lost humans, but an organized effort by an entire population that had made protecting our species part of their cultural mission. "They've been watching us for generations," Linda explained, showing me documentation she'd compiled over years of investigation. "Not studying us like specimens, but caring for us the way you'd care for children who kept wandering into dangerous territory. They understand that we're intelligent but naive about wilderness survival, so they help when they can do so without revealing themselves." The being who had saved Linda and Emma had been part of something unprecedented in human experience, a non-human intelligence that had chosen to serve as guardian rather than competitor, protecting our species despite having every reason to see us as a threat to their survival. The federal hunting operations of the 1980s had been based on assumptions that any unknown intelligence must be either weapon or target, never considering the possibility of benevolent contact. But the most profound revelation came when Linda showed me recent photographs taken by wildlife cameras in remote areas of the Cascade Mountains. The images were distant and partially obscured, but they clearly showed massive bipedal figures moving through forest terrain with the same careful intelligence we'd documented in 1984. The beings we'd thought had vanished were still there, still protecting lost humans while avoiding the surveillance technology that hunted them. "Emma's going to have children someday," Linda said, as our conversation drew to its conclusion. "I want them to grow up understanding that there are forces in this world that choose to protect rather than exploit, intelligences that see beauty and value in consciousness even when it's different from their own. I want them to know that kindness exists in forms we've never imagined." As I drove home from that meeting, I understood that my years of enforced silence were finally over. The classification orders that had controlled my life for nearly 3 decades no longer mattered, because the truth was too important to remain hidden. Somewhere in the mountains I'd spent my career exploring, beings of extraordinary intelligence and compassion continued their ancient work of protecting lost humans. The federal agents who had hunted them with tranquilizer weapons and containment facilities would never understand what they'd been trying to capture. They'd been looking for specimens to study and weapons to control, never recognizing that they were encountering something far more precious: proof that intelligence and consciousness naturally tend toward compassion when they're allowed to develop without fear. Emma Morrison would learn the truth before her wedding because some gifts are too important to remain secret forever. And somewhere in the mountains where her life had been saved by kindness beyond human understanding, beings who chose protection over predation continued their quiet work of keeping our children safe when they wandered too far from home.